Hello and welcome to the last chapter of 1 Samuel, and that's chapter 31, and then we would have done this entire book. Let's get started. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. So as predicted, it didn't go well for Saul. So the battle that Samuel had prophesied was finally coming true. The risen from the dead Samuel, the one that we're still unsure about whether it was really Samuel or, so the prophecy that deceased Samuel predicted was coming true. And a common strategy that they used in ancient times was to target the king and his sons. So this was a common strategy. In ancient times, to target the king. His sons. And sadly, our lovely Jonathan and his brothers, they were killed, and Saul was severely wounded. Then said Saul unto his armour-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me. But his armour-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. So Saul knew that if he was captured, he'd have a very slow, painful death by the Philistines. Saul knew if he were captured, they'd torture him. And so he asked his armour-bearer to kill him, but he wouldn't do it, so he had to do it himself. So you might say it's suicide, and therefore you could argue, well, did Samuel really prophesy that because he said it'd be killed by the hand of the Philistines? But technically he was wounded by them and was dying anyway, so yes, you could argue that that was a true prophecy. And when his armour-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armour-bearer, and all his men, that same day together. And when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side of Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. And so they got so freaked out. Israel saw that their kings were down, his sons were down, that they fled. They escaped, and the Philistines came and dwelt in their towns. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, and stripped off his armour, and sent it into the land of the Philistines round about, to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people. And they put his armour in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. So while they weren't able to torture Saul, they did abuse his body and dishonour his body. So Philistines still dishonoured Saul's body, and they cut off his head and hung him up on display. And they put his armour into the house of their gods as well, which adds more insult to injury. So that's their gods, the house of their gods. So we have a really important lesson here. Look what happened to Saul. So remember, Israel begged for a king. God wasn't enough for them. So they begged for a human king, and he warned them. He goes, this isn't going to work, this isn't a good idea. And they insisted, and so he said, okay, have your way. And look what happened. So Saul was disobedient to God. He completely spiritually collapsed as well, and that affected not just him and his own family, but the entire people of Israel. So their king was dead, family was killed, army was destroyed, and they had lost part of their territory. And the Lord had been dishonoured, even worse, of all of that, because they didn't listen. There was a history of the Israelites not listening to God. It's so annoying, but you know, it happens. Because we're sinners. Right, let me see if I can make a note of everything I just said. Right, okay. So Saul's disobedience to God ended tragically. For him, his family, and Israel, who insisted on wanting Saul as a king, despite God's warnings. And as we've seen in previous chapters, had Saul just done what God asked, while he wasn't God's choice for a king, he still could have enjoyed God's blessings if he had obeyed God with all his heart. But you know, we saw what he was like. He was half-hearted, he always made excuses, and you know, did things like going to a medium instead of looking to the Lord as well. So he did a lot of things wrong. So Saul was half-hearted, disobedient, quick to make excuses, and blame others. Not to mention wanting to hunt down poor little Daniel after everything he did. And I also said he could have had God's blessings if he was obedient. Oh, I'm running out of space. Saul could have enjoyed God's blessings if he were obedient and didn't try to kill Daniel or go to mediums. And just follow the Lord's direction. He didn't kill the Amalekite king, and look what they ended up going and doing to him. Like, it all just went wrong because of Saul's disobedience. Okay, let's just finish off this last bit of the book here. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So these people of Jabesh Gilead had been saved by Saul many years earlier, and here they were showing their gratitude. So these people had been Saul. And we're showing their gratitude. And so what they did is they honoured Saul and his son's bodies. They a very dangerous trip, and went travelling all night and going to the wall where the Philistines were, saved their bodies and gave them the proper goodbye that they deserved. And then they fasted for 7 days. Now, like, that's a long time, and that's a real genuine grief. So let's put that down here because I'm running out of space. So I'll write a genuine grief. For all of Israel. Saul's sin and rejection. Of the Lord's will. Brought destruction and shame. Destruction and shame. On the whole kingdom. They had reached a low that only God could pull them out of. How many of us have been there? I mean, that's probably many of our testimonies where we're at a point where we literally are such a low, and we're like, I can't get out of this, I need you, God. How many times? I can think of many occasions where I've just been at an all-time low. I'm like, I've got nothing. God is the only one that can get me through this. And so far he has every single time. He is faithful. You've just got to keep working in alignment with his will. Obey as best you can. Keep listening to him. Keep leaning on him. And he will guide us and he will help us through. And he is going to help Israel because we've got a new king lined up for the throne, as we know. So then we're going to jump straight into 2 Samuel after this one. So join me then for a brand new book tomorrow. And I hope you've enjoyed this part of the Bible study. I did only start like right at the end of 1 Samuel. So yes, from now on you'll get to see the entire book and how I go through and study everything. So I hope that's been helpful. Please leave any questions or comments you've got and I'll happy to get back to you. Have a lovely day. Bye.